Week 5, Overview. Jefferson and the Supreme Court. Let's look at Thomas Jefferson's second term and the growth of the Supreme Court. Dialectic students this week will keep one eye on events in Europe. Napoleon's string of military successes there hit a brick wall when he tried to take over Spain and Portugal. He didn't lose the Peninsular War exactly, but he lost his illusion of invincibility. As for Jefferson, all in all, his second term went downhill. He ran into trouble from old friends and old enemies. There were men like John Marshall, a Federalist of the opposition party, who had just taken office as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court to great effect. Under Marshall, the judiciary truly became equal to the other branches of the federal government. But it wasn't just Jefferson's political enemies who caused him problems. His own vice president, Aaron Burr, had caused problems during his first term. When Jefferson decided not to keep him on as running mate when he ran for re-election, Burr caused even bigger problems. No one can control what other people do, but Jefferson reacted so badly to Burr's inappropriate actions that it cost a lasting blot on his own reputation. But let's start with the growth of the Supreme Court. The United States Constitution lays out a government that divides power to safeguard freedom. Power is divided two ways: horizontally into three branches, executive, legislative, and judicial, and vertically between the central government and the state governments. By the time Jefferson took office, Presidents Washington and Adams had laid down substantial precedents for the executive branch, and Congress, the legislative branch, had been functioning for 12 years with precedents of its own. What was still largely undefined was the third branch of government, the judicial branch. In January of 1801, just before Jefferson was sworn into office, John Adams had nominated John Marshall to be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Marshall was a Federalist, like the outgoing President Adams. Like many other Federalists, Marshall believed in strengthening the central government, even if it meant interpreting the Constitution very liberally. Thomas Jefferson was Marshall's distant cousin and was the leader of the competing political party, the Democratic Republicans. Jefferson was passionate about states' rights and had a strict construction of the Constitution. These were two strong men with clear and conflicting visions of what was best for their country. Marshall's first important case at the Supreme Court didn't look very important. In 1801, just as John Adams was leaving office, Congress passed the Judiciary Act of 1801, which allowed Adams to make more than 200 court appointments just before he left office. Jefferson asked Congress to repeal the act and told the appointees they should act as though the appointments had never been made. William Marbury was one of these appointees, and he applied to the Supreme Court for a writ of mandamus. That's a court order commanding the recipient to do what is legal, ordering Secretary of State James Madison to give him his commission. The Supreme Court had gained the ability to issue these writs through the Judiciary Act of 1789. In the decision of the Supreme Court, however, Marshall declared unconstitutional the part of the Judiciary Act that gave them the power to issue writs of mandamus. On the surface, this decision looked good for Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans, for the court refused to deliver the writ. However, this is one of the most important Supreme Court cases in history, for it also established the court's ability to declare a congressional law unconstitutional, a power known as judicial review. Marbury v. Madison was just the first of several steps that Chief Justice John Marshall took in strengthening the judicial branch. Several other important cases included McCulloch v. Maryland, which said that Congress possessed implied powers that are not specifically stated in the Constitution. There was Fletcher v. Peck, which established judicial review over state laws as well as federal laws. And there was Gibbons v. Ogden, which defined national power over interstate commerce. By the time Marshall died, the Supreme Court had gained equal authority with the executive and legislative branches. Thomas Jefferson had served as vice president to John Adams from 1796 to 1800, where he was a thorn in Adams's side. Aaron Burr didn't make things any easier on his boss when he became Jefferson's vice president. Burr was trouble from the start, so Jefferson decided not to keep him around when he ran for re-election. When Burr heard that, he ran for governor of New York with a plan to have New York secede from the Union. Alexander Hamilton had broken with his own Federalist party to get Jefferson and Burr elected, but he opposed Burr's campaign to be governor of New York. As part of that opposition, Hamilton wrote several blistering pieces in New York newspapers opposing Burr. Burr was defeated in the election, and he felt that his honor had been impugned. He challenged Hamilton to a duel. He shot Hamilton, who died the next day. Although dueling was not exactly illegal at the time, a sitting vice president just can't go around shooting people like Alexander Hamilton. Burr was indicted for murder in New York and New Jersey. He wasn't convicted, but the damage to his reputation was done. He was treated like a murderer in the North and East, where public opinion turned against him. His political career was in big trouble now, although he was still popular in the South and West. After his term as vice president was over, he left on a tour of American lands west of the Appalachians. While there, he formed his own regiment of armed men. Historians aren't in complete agreement about what happened next, but before long he was at least accused of treason. Officials claimed that he had formed a conspiracy to steal Louisiana Purchase lands away from the United States and crown himself king or emperor of a new nation. Burr was arrested in 1807 and charged with treason. Thomas Jefferson, his old running mate, demanded that he be found guilty, but he made the demand before the trial had even begun. That's a problem. The president has no constitutional authority to intervene in a trial in that way. Jefferson clearly overstepped his authority as president, which probably skewed the court toward its eventual acquittal of Burr. Chief Justice John Marshall presided over the trial. He interpreted the charge of treason so narrowly that jurors were left with little choice in their deliberations. Article 3, Section 3 of the United States Constitution defines treason as levying war against the United States or helping the enemies of the United States. To be found guilty of treason, a defendant must admit to it in open court, or the charge must be proved by an overt act witnessed by at least two people. Burr didn't confess, and the government couldn't prove that he'd gone to war against the United States. He was acquitted because the evidence didn't fulfill the requirements to prove it, as laid out in the Constitution. Over in Europe, Britain and France were duking it out during the Napoleonic Wars. Jefferson did his best to keep the United States out of the war and still maintain America's neutral rights. The French had set their continental system in place, which prevented neutral ships from going to British ports, and the British had retaliated by blockading all French ports. The practical result of this was that almost any ship sailing near the European continent would get stopped, boarded, and possibly captured by either the British or the French. In retaliation for this violation of American neutrality, Jefferson forced the Embargo Act through Congress, which prohibited any exports from the United States and would not let American ships sail into any foreign ports. Jefferson hoped by this to pressure Europe into ending the war by depriving them of American goods, but instead he just crippled the U.S. economy. In his effort to justify and enforce the Embargo Act, Jefferson began to promote more and more federal regulation, limiting liberties in ports, building a stronger navy, and so forth. This violated his political principle of keeping the federal government small, and it never fixed what was fundamentally wrong with the Embargo Act. Public outrage increased until Congress finally stepped in, replacing the embargo with the milder Non-Intercourse Act. Now, while all this was going on, Napoleon was trying to conquer Spain and Portugal, the two countries located on the Iberian Peninsula. Dialectic level students will learn all about it this week, even though quite a bit of the action took place after Jefferson left office. Initially, Napoleon quickly subdued Spain's capital and set his brother Joseph on the throne. What he didn't plan on was the stubborn resistance of the Spanish and Portuguese people who refused to accept his rule. In 1808, they rose up in revolt. The French laid siege to Saragossa, capital of the ancient Spanish province of Aragon. Although the French eventually took the city, the heroic resistance is an important part of Spanish history. They still tell the story of the Maid of Saragossa, who bravely fired a cannon when the Spanish soldiers had been slain or temporarily driven back. The British sent troops to help the Spanish resistance. They fought major battles at Corunna and Talavera in 1809. Sir Arthur Wellesley's ground forces outflanked the hitherto unbeatable French army. Within a few more years, tens of thousands of French troops had died in the Peninsular War, and the remaining French forces were driven back home. Let's wrap up with Jefferson's final years. He decided not to run for a third term, choosing to respect George Washington's example and step down after two. He spent his final years pursuing his many interests, while still taking time to give his advice on political affairs. He founded the University of Virginia in his later years, helping to write the curriculum, hire the faculty, and select the library books. He designed the campus and encouraged international scholars to join the faculty. After Jefferson left office, he carried on a warm correspondence with his old political rival, John Adams. Interestingly enough, Jefferson died on the very same day as John Adams, who was now his close friend. The day they both died was July 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. We'll wrap up our study of Thomas Jefferson with the inscription on his tombstone. It said, "Here lies buried Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, of the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia." The tombstone doesn't even mention being President of the United States. That's because Jefferson chose his own inscription. How many other men lived so large that just being president doesn't make it to the top 3 in one's own list of life's accomplishments?